this need to acquire material wealth, this combination of political ownership and the ownership of wealth, that is a problem which, of course, has impeded development. In other words, the creation of an elite that exists in part by denying the capacity for others to rise up. In other words, it's the fortifying of a certain group of people that will then not wish to subject itself to free and fair elections, not wish necessarily to protect the rights of citizens, including their political rights. So this gives rise to all kinds of discontents. It gives rise, of course, to all kinds of thoughts of rebellion. Thoughts of rebellion that very often, because political parties are persecuted, suppressed, if not outright repressed, and their leaders are imprisoned, beaten, in some cases very, very severely, then what you have is the turn to extra-legal, extra-constitutional forms of organization for the sake of rebellion. These could be rebellions based on not political thought, but religious thought. There you have all kinds of sanctions in both Christianity and in Islam for the just rebellion. That's the title of another one of my courses here at SOAS, a body of thought that allows you to make a political statement, a political challenge, and to attempt often a political overthrow. Now, these are extra-constitutional, outside the Constitution, a Constitution which, of course, may all the same be subject to abuse by the present people in power. Nevertheless, the response to extra-constitutional militarized rebellion on the part, for instance, of religious groups that may wish to impose a particular variant of a religion upon others without any choice on the part of those others, what you have is a difficulty which sometimes can only be answered by military means, and those military means are not always efficacious, not always well organized, and begs all kinds of questions not only of national governments and their capacity to respond, but of the African Union in terms of its capacity to help governments to respond, or of the capacity of the African Union itself to intervene militarily if national governments not only lack the capacity to resist on behalf of their citizens military oppression, but themselves perpetrate it, perhaps using cover of religious or related groups, or very, very directly. The case of Darfur, for instance, comes to mind in the early part of the 21st century, and the use by President Bashir of militias, both tribal and religiously organized militias, the Janjaweed, for instance, to crush rebellion on the part of those who wished to have a more transparent society and equal society in the province of Darfur, which is a very, very large province, about the size of Germany. And you have there an example where you would have expected the new African Union philosophy, it was dignified with that term. It wasn't really a philosophy, it was a political principle of non-indifference. In other words, this was meant to replace the Organization for African Unity's slogan of non-interference, which in turn derived from the statement of the Chinese Prime Minister Zhou Enlai in 1955 at the Bandung Conference in Indonesia, which was the precursor of the non-aligned movement, that he promised that China would help the emerging countries of Africa and Asia, and it would never interfere. So the doctrine of non-interference became a standard cry in the programs for independence, that once we achieve independence, our own nationalism, we would seek to deal with outside powers that would not interfere. The Chinese made much of this for their own, as it were, contributions to African development, which have been, particularly in recent years, problematic. So you have, as it were, this doctrine which was imported to Africa as a standard form of behavior and as a standard principle. But it was not a principle that was able to meet injustice meted out by governments to their own citizens. Violence, militarized violence, pogroms, what some have called rather loosely genocide. I really dislike the loose term genocide. It has a very precise definition. It was certainly a genocide in Rwanda, just like it was a genocide against the Jews in Nazi Germany. But it cheapens the term when it's applied loosely. But certainly massacres, slaughters, all of those things for political purposes, those are terms that can certainly be used to describe what President Bashir was unleashing in Darfur. And the African Union was reluctant to do anything decisive, despite its new policy of we're no longer going to practice indifference, and it's going to be a policy of non-indifference. They sent observer groups, monitoring groups, finally a very, very small military force, all the same with a mandate to observe and monitor. And it really took, as it were, United Nations Security Council endorsement of the need for intervention before the African Union basically increased its military presence. Now, it was a problematic military presence. I knew both the high end and the low end of this. As I said, Darfur is a very, very large country. And so I had a talk with one of the commanders, one of the early commanders of the peacekeeping forces. He had commanded both the tail end of the very modest African Union military observer group, monitoring group, and the beginnings of the UN-AU hybrid peacekeeping forces. From Nigeria, General Agwai. I was able to have a discussion with General Agwai, and I said, what do you need? He said, helicopters. And I said, how many do you have? And he said, 2. And I said, you can't do much with 2 helicopters in a country of that size. What do you use them for? And he said, I travel from location to location so I can be there for the burials, the funerals of my men. Then, because I had friends, former students in the Zambat, the Zambian battalion that was part of the peacekeeping forces, I was able to talk to them, well, what's it like on the ground? They said, well, we're sitting ducks because we've got no maneuverability. The enemy, the Janjaweed, whoever is today's armed gang posing as a rebel group, has got far greater maneuverability than we have. We build fortifications and wait to be attacked. In other words, we were sent here as a presence. We're not armed properly to resist these attacks. We don't have mobility in terms of fast-moving armored cars. We sit here and take it, and then General Agwai will come for the funerals. It's completely frustrating for us as the soldiers on the ground. In other words, there was no seriousness about this as a peacekeeping effort. In terms of logistical planning capacity, logistical execution of what was needed in the conditions of Darfur, and basically lack of real engagement on the part of political leaders with those logistical and strategic needs. The world at large put in a lot of aid. In fact, this increased the problem because a lot of this, particularly the medical aid, was very attractive to bandit gangs. And so there would be all of these raids. The bandit gangs would then say, oh no, we're a rebel movement. In other words, the proliferation of rebel movements made peace talks almost impossible. The peacekeepers would say, which groups are we talking to today? I've never heard of that one before. Where did that come from? Oh, that was the bandit gang who stole our, basically, cancer machines. In other words, what you had in the camps for displaced persons were basically hastily constructed small cities with hospitals that were in fact better equipped than other hospitals in Sudan. So you had a problem there of international engagement that also was not planned because, of course, those camps for displaced persons needed to have a proper military defense. And the military defense also had to segue with the peacekeepers who were trying to conduct negotiations. You had to have a President Bashir prepared to negotiate in good faith, and you had to have a means of identification as to who was a negotiator in good faith from the other sides, plural. And the proliferation of sides, agendas, disguises, camouflages became something which the AU certainly was not able to solve. But it did at least establish the possibility that an AU presence in a theatre of armed conflict was possible. So talk began about the creation of an African rapid deployment force. The big test of this, as I've said to you before, was in Mali. They couldn't get there in time, the French could, and if the African Union Rapid Deployment Force had been able to get there in time, would it have had the logistical capacity, the strategic capacity to roll back the rebels in Mali, who were superbly generaled and equipped. And it took very sophisticated means, both material, logistical means on the one hand, and generalship on the other, on the part of the French forces to roll them back. So the question about rapid deployment forces, fine in principle, is to do with speed of deployment, equipment you have at the moment of deployment, strategic doctrine, how do you deploy, for what ends, and if it's a multinational force, in other words, you have armed personnel from several African armies, are they joined up in terms of strategic thinking, in terms of background of training, in terms of equipment, if you can't share bullets when one part of your contingent runs out because they're using different ordnance to other parts of the same peacekeeping unit, and then the whole thing becomes, of course, a disaster. Lack of aerial cover, lack of helicopters, lack of cargo transport planes to get equipment from one part of Africa to another. None of this exists. So when we talk about certain things to do with actual African Union, even in terms of military cooperation, what you have are all of these expensively equipped national armies that can't do anything. They're parade ground armies. They're often used instead of police to suppress dissent in the streets. They're not very good at that because they haven't been trained for that, so they shoot people, as not only in Africa but in Myanmar, for instance. So in those terms, in terms of military thinking, in terms of peacekeeping thinking, nothing new, nothing original, nothing advanced coming out of the African Union. There's been the creation of a number of peacekeeping training centers. One of my former PhD students has helped to write the syllabus of these. The standard. They don't teach you to deal with the individual characteristics of why the peace was broken down in a certain way, or the different methodologies that different armed groups use to steal the peace. They don't teach you to what kind of peace you're seeking to restore a situation. If it was a peace in which there was huge political discontent in any case, which rebel groups took advantage of, from what are you rescuing those who are suffering war? Well, you're rescuing them from war, but if you return them to the status quo ante, what is their condition as citizens for the future? So that kind of thinking has not yet become advanced. And of course, the use of religion as a cloak, and it's used as a cloak for all kinds of things. We began today's session by talking about the use on the part of John Magufuli of Christian faith as a rhetorical instrument to repudiate the need for medical preparedness and treatment of a genuine medical pandemic. What you have is the use and the misuse of faith of different sorts that can cause all kinds of national problems. And again, the African Union really doesn't have a template of thought as to how to deal with this. When he was still the Emir of Kano, a very ancient Nigerian kingdom, one of great civilizational splendor, but the Emir had been a considerable technocrat himself. Dr. Sanusi had been the governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria. he had to leave that position because of conflict with the then president of Nigeria, Goodluck Jonathan, whom Sanusi called out for corruption. A very, very brave central bank governor, and indeed, in technical terms, he won plaudits from other central bank governors around the world as a particularly good central bank governor. Believe it or not, these people have their own magazine, and he was the cover boy of this magazine as the central bank governor of the year. So he knew one or two things in technocratic terms. All the same, when he became Emir of Kano, an Islamic part of Nigeria, one with very, very conservative elements in it, meaning that all kinds of things that we would regard as progressive were extremely difficult, such as the equality and the emancipation of women, he faced a problem. A modern, technocratic, but Islamic ruler, traditional ruler, had loggerheads with the formal constitutional government. So there's actually a question of constitutional separation of powers here, which indeed, at the end, the government won by deposing the Emir of Kano, replacing Sanusi with another. But while he was Emir, he pondered the problems. And as he said when I was hosting him to the SOAS students, look, my own daughters complain. I've got to take the question of the emancipation of women forward one step at a time. Maybe it even seems like an inch at a time. Because if I go too fast on this and other issues of progressive modernity, then I will deliver my people to Boko Haram. Boko Haram will seem more attractive than what I'm trying to do. So my question to you, the students of SOAS, is a very simple one. Is it better to go forward an inch at a time, or not to go forward at all, and perhaps go backwards? Now, this is a profound question, and it's one that national governments have not fully addressed. It's one that the vision of African unity and the present institutions of African Union have not addressed. But if you are going to have an African unity one day, particularly one that is culturally based as opposed to scientifically based, then this is an African unity that must encompass religion in all of its diversity. What political thought exists on that? And what religious thought exists of a sophisticated ecumenical nature on questions of unity? So these are unanswered questions for the future of Africa. Constitutionalism's thought on that? Well, there are two approaches to this. The jurisprudential thinker from Tanzania, Isa Shivji, has proposed the possibility of a return to local deliberative councils, village by village, like in the old days, although it wasn't always like that in every part of Africa, with kingship societies of a hierarchical and vertical nature. But then how do you get your message up to the top in a way which avoids sectional interests, one village locality being stronger than another, for instance? The great, as it were, accomplishment of equality would again be by scientific means. The example that comes to my mind is Estonia. I've been a visiting professor at the University of Tallinn. I was amazed by how joined up the society is electronically. Civil society in Estonia can interrogate every single deliberation and every single decision taken by every single part of government. It's all there online. Of course, you've got to take the time to read it, to research it, but it's there for civil society groups, if they have the capacity, if they have the wish to interrogate it, it can be done. What we need perhaps is a generation jump in Africa in terms of electronic joined up communications and capacities as well. Can an outside power like the Chinese help with this, despite the technophobia of the South African political establishment, for instance, the political establishment of liberation, the ANC? Yes, the Chinese can, although the Chinese are very, very good at getting into international power games to do with joined up communication. Huawei, for instance, the rollout of 5G being a case in point to do with that. But it raises the question about, well, can the African Union have a joined up policy towards China? a treaty that establishes limits to what China should not do, a code of good behavior. Not so much upon the Chinese government, to a certain extent. Its behavior has been extremely good at the official level. The indebtedness of individual African countries is not necessarily something forced upon them by the Chinese, it's by reckless borrowing on the part of individual governments. So you have, as it were, a question of what can be done to call upon the Chinese government to control its nationals who come out as private business people in African countries and often create havoc. Being able to approach the Chinese government in equal negotiating terms has certainly been accomplished by individual governments. The Angolans, the Ethiopians in particular, have become very good about that. Having the national capacity to do that is important. Now, this is where the African Union could play a role, but doesn't. I was a member of the delegations, negotiating delegations led by the deputy chair of the African Union, Patrick Masumhaka. We negotiated in Beijing, much to the consternation of the Chinese when they found that the African delegation had a Chinese member. But the problem was that after the fall of the person to whom he was deputy, the one that Dlamini Zuma replaced after a power play by South Africa, what you had was no longer a concentration or an emphasis on the African Union negotiating as a body and developing templates and strategies of negotiation on behalf of the body of South African and other African interests and needs and South African and other African states. And what you had instead was a neglect of this question. In a way, it was a great pity that Dlamini Zuma succeeded, because the previous chair of the Commission of the African Union, Jean Ping, from Gabon, was, as the name suggested, half Chinese. He was the son of an immigrant father from a much earlier generation. He was what we might today call an economic migrant who decided to stay, became deeply accepted by the local population, became mayor of his own town. This allowed him to educate his children so that Jean Ping, the son, had a classic francophonic formation and went to the best universities, the most elite institutions in Paris, for instance, but all the same was half Chinese. He looked like a very dark Chinese person. And what you would have had there in terms of symbolism, in terms of negotiating with China itself, would have been something very, very profound. Africa misses capacity, it also misses symbols. So these are things, again, which have not been given great thought in the deliberations of the wise and the good in Africa today. And the nature of new constitutionalisms based on electronic transparency has not been given much thought, and in particular what protocol should exist in dealing with the Chinese in terms of their provision of Belt and Road facilities, including electronic communications facilities and capacities. That has not been thought through in scientific terms. So, ladies and gentlemen, all kinds of problems. Can this be solved by way of, let us say, thought that we've often, particularly in our youthful days, put much store on? Can we have a resurgence of Marxism? We had the recent death of the Egyptian thinker Samir Amin, probably the greatest Marxist thinker that Africa has produced in modern times. Again, I hosted Samir Amin here in SOAS, a profound person whose books on delinking from Europe and resisting Eurocentrism basically laid a huge, as it were, political philosophical statement at the feet of people like Sabelo, Gashedi, and Lovu for him to be able to take further forward. So I keep getting those two surnames mixed up. It's Sabelo Ndlovu Gacheni. In Zimbabwe, Ndlovu is usually the final surname. So what you have is very, very much a great affection and admiration for the grand old man and his magnificent books. But what do they teach us about the modern condition, where you still don't have a working class, you still don't have forces of production of an industrial nature, you still don't have industrial planning capacity, political strategies on industrialization in most countries. You have basically not only a lack of medical scientists in government, but a lack of agronomists, agriculturalists, in other words, and a lack of engineers in very high places in government. The lack of an industrial strategy, the lack of an industrial capacity, the lack of industrial thought means the field is wide open for others to fill those vacuums. So, although, ladies and gentlemen, this course has been primarily to deal with the political thought of Africa, the lacunae, the gaps, the absences, the vacancies, the vacuums of thought that exist because of political neglect form, as it were, a backdrop for our contemplation of what Africa needs for the future. And in particular, the African Union, can it become like an African version of the European Union with all of its problems? Well, I think that there are two big things that need to be done here, quite apart from the issue of military intervention and the logistical capacity to do that properly. And there's logistical capacity in general. If you don't have joined up communications, you don't have joined up roads, railways, if you don't have the Chinese doing that as part of their Belt and Road Initiative, north to south, east to west, basically, let us say, from Lagos to Kenya, from Cairo to Cape Town, you're just not going to be able to even inflect government, let alone the values of governance, upon Africa. It depends on being able to deliver the goods of development. It depends on being able to communicate with one another. Electronic communication systems allow citizens to communicate and to protest and to interrogate what governments are doing, so that constitutional change and the restriction of the power grabs of the oligarch politicians, the neo-patrimonialists, depend on empowering the citizen body electronically, in my opinion. No thought of that has really been advanced seriously coming out of Africa at this moment in time, either by the politicians or by the philosophers. And that is something which requires some dealing with, and nor has it come out of the African Union. Whereas all of these things are observed from the outside, so that when I was hoping to open the 8th African Development Forum, my liaison officer, my assistant, given to me, in this case courtesy of the African Development Bank, was a Chinese intern, a young man. He's superb. He did everything I needed. He provided everything on the spot. He informed me as to exactly what was going on, how I should address certain people, a discreet background presence, never interfered, always facilitated. And I knew that he was there not only to learn about the institutions of African cooperation, the Economic Commission for Africa, the African Development Bank, the African Union itself, the headquarters of which were built by the Chinese, terribly designed, I think. The statue, gold, of Kwame Nkrumah in terribly bad taste, I think. But all of these things were necessarily owed to the Chinese, because no one else was going to do that. So the African intern was there very, very much, not only to help me and to learn about the African Union, but to basically share his learning with his masters back home. He wouldn't have been able to get that internship without, let us say, some sponsorship from the government and the party of China itself. All of these things bespeak a lot of thought about Africa by others. And the challenge is for Africa to think for itself. So, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.